Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're jumping right into a really fascinating and honestly pretty provocative historical investigation by Denzel Kenobi. We'll be looking at his essay, Crafty Counsels and Popular Persuasions, which asks a massive question. How was early Christian doctrine actually formed and legislated? You know, this text challenges a deeply entrenched narrative about the origins of imperial Christianity. It asks us to look past comforting assumptions and instead examine the cold, hard, documented history of how certain theological decisions were made, recorded, and ultimately enforced by the sheer machinery of the state. And why does this matter? Well, because millions of people today practice a faith that was quite literally shaped by the men sitting in these specific rooms.
Kenobi immediately sets up a really stark contrast for us. We're so often taught this comforting myth, right? This picture of a faith descending like rain, whole, unbroken, passed hand to hand from the apostles directly to the modern pew without a single alteration. But he argues the historical reality is quite different. The teachings that came to define imperial Christianity were argued into shape in loud assembly halls, ratified by the votes of men, and then strictly enforced by the Roman state.
So, to impartially unpack all this history, we're going to follow a quick roadmap. We'll look at the myth of unbroken doctrine, the role of councils and state power, how times and laws were changed, the roots of this popular persuasion, and finally, why remembering this actually matters. Let's kick things off with that first point, the myth of unbroken doctrine. The author actually anchors his investigation in Psalm 83, which talks about those who, quote, have taken crafty counsel against thy people, for they have consulted together with one consent. Kenobi points out something super important here. Historical councils act as instruments of consensus. But as we all know, consensus is not necessarily the same thing as truth. A roomful of guys can absolutely agree with one consent on something that essentially erases a covenant rather than honoring it. It's a scriptural pattern of consultation that really sets the stage for his whole historical analysis. Moving right along to the second major theme, how councils intersect with state power. Now, a really fascinating cipher is used here to define the institutional forces at play. Kenobi draws on the biblical archetype of Edom, Esau's house, but the text is scrupulously clear, so pay attention to this. Edom operates purely as a prophetic cipher for Rome and state power. Think of it as an institutional pattern of cleverness and state-sponsored consensus. Kenobi explicitly states this has absolutely zero to do with racial, genealogical, or bloodline claims. He's focusing strictly on the documentary record of institutions and the doctrines they pumped out.
We actually see this exact merger of state and theology take flesh at the Council of Nicaea in 325 AD. Constantine did something totally unprecedented. He didn't just casually summon the council. He literally subsidized the bishop's travel, presided over the opening himself, and then enforced their conclusions with the full weight of his empire. Just think about that dynamic for a second. When the guy paying the bills and commanding the Roman army wants unity, the theology is naturally going to bend to his will. Early covenant practices suddenly became a political liability that the state felt it absolutely had to manage.
This perfectly tees up our third point, the actual changing of times and laws. Using Daniel chapter 7 as a framework, the author details the exact mechanism by which a power opposed to the Most High actually legislates. The scripture warns of a power that will think to change times and laws. Kenobi argues this wasn't just some vague, poetic prophecy. He says it was a precise description of exactly what the early church councils demonstrably did to the appointed seasons and the specific ordinances governing them.
And the historical record brilliantly illustrates this exact mechanism in action. First, let's look at the times. At Nicaea, the reckoning of Passover was officially decoupled from the Hebrew lunar calendar. The stated motive, which was actually preserved by Constantine's own historian Eusebius, was deliberately to avoid keeping the feast in common with the Jewish observance. Then we have the laws. A generation later, at the Synod of Laodicea, Canon 29 quite literally outlawed resting on the seventh-day Sabbath. Christians were mandated to work on that day and honor Sunday instead, under the strict threat of being anathema, or completely cut off from the Messiah. And to be anathema in the 4th century, that wasn't just a harsh word. It meant total social and spiritual exile. So you have both times and laws deliberately altered by official votes.
Which brings us to part 4, the roots of this popular persuasion. The absolute crucial point here is that these councils didn't just invent this hostility out of thin air. It definitely didn't happen overnight. Instead, what we see is a slow, multi-generational drip of hostility. Decades before Nicaea, there was an ideological buildup of what's called the adverse Judaist tradition, meaning literature specifically written against the Jews. We go from Justin Martyr arguing around 155 AD that the covenant was transferred away from Israel to Melito of Sardis leveling intense charges of deicide, right down to the highly corrosive sermons of John Chrysostom in the late 300s. Kenobi's analysis proves that this doctrine of supersession, the idea that the original covenant people were entirely replaced, well, it was in the water long before it was ever ratified into official canon law.
All of this leads us to a pretty fundamental question. If these changes were indeed massive deviations from the original covenant, how does an error transform into what feels like the settled, unquestionable faith itself? Well, Kenobi breaks this down into the anatomy of what he calls a popular persuasion. Error, he notes, doesn't advance under its own ugly name. No way. It advances disguised as piety. First, it's carried by respected men. Then it's ratified by grand impressive assemblies and blessed by the ultimate authority of the state. Finally, it's written into the historical record by victor historians like Constantine's biographer Eusebius. It is truly wild to see how historians were essentially employed to make these imperial shifts look not just good but completely inevitable. By the time it reaches the average person centuries later, to even question it feels like an act of impiety. And that leads us to our final section, the imperative of remembrance.
Kenobi stresses an incredibly important point here. Investigating this history should not be an exercise in division. It absolutely shouldn't cause resentment toward ordinary believers who innocently inherited these historical settlements. Think about it. If you're sitting in a pew today, you didn't write these laws, you simply inherited them. Most people have never even read a single canon from the Synod of Laodicea. Instead, the author argues that uncovering this history should spark a patient, honest recovery of what Crafty counsel set aside. It's about a refusal to let the original names, times, and laws be totally forgotten.
We'll wrap up this explainer with Kenobi's rather profound final thought. He writes, "A vote, however consented to, however ancient, has never once overturned the word of the Most High." It's a really powerful reminder that historical consensus, no matter how officially ratified by emperors or bishops, doesn't inherently dictate eternal truth. And it leaves us with a compelling, provocative question to ponder as we step away today. If early councils voted to fundamentally alter the times and the laws, what else might history be asking us to remember?